You're tuned to Risky Business, Good News Business Talk Show. I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, and with me in the studio, I have Jonathan Shaw, my production manager and co-host. Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, B, how's it going? All good my side. Doing very well. Pending all the technical challenges.
Absolutely, and all good, all fine. Thank you. Doing swimmingly, and I'm delighted to say I have a special guest in the studio with us this evening, in the form of Steve Mallaby, who is the Chief Commercial Officer of an international organization called MyFanPark. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ryan. Yeah, thanks, and great to be here, and good to also be with you on the line, Jonathan. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. Well,
Yes, so
Nice to meet you,
it's really
Steve.
just going to
Welcome.
flow. I don't have an agenda of questions I'm going to throw at you, because then it takes the fun and the spontaneity and the life out of it. So many things that have been happening in our world and around us, and let's just at the moment stick it into the world of business. Have caused many people and many leaders to turn a whiter shade of pale. Challenging times and uncertain times, and just when you think it's all going to get better and well, things go differently. I remember lots of people at the end of 2025 saying, 2026 is going to be a great year. And then we stepped into it, and next thing, the Gulf War and all sorts of things around us. But putting the Gulf War aside, um, I wanted to chat to you because I know it's a big passion of yours, the whole subject of leadership. And I want to talk a little bit about your journey. So maybe let's start with that. Where does Steve come from, and what's your story?
geez, wow, that's I'll get back to my story in a moment, but I recall, obviously, I think you and I have chatted over time and realized we both have a deep passion for leaders and what makes leaders tick. And I recall giving a talk once about sort of way back in the time there was this concept of VUCA. That's
Oh,
uh,
yes.
the analogy, the acronym, and it stood for volatility, I think, uncertainty, the chaos. Yeah, I can't remember.
Change.
Change. That's right.
Change, maybe.
And ambiguity. And sure, I don't
Yes.
know when that. I don't think there's ever been a time when you haven't really had that. So yeah, off the backdrop of what you were sharing, I think it's just perhaps different levels of that. As we go through our time.
I
Yeah,
wonder. I
Brian.
wonder if VUCA um, does if the C doesn't mean complexity. It's not change. It's complexity.
That's right. It is the complex.
Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
That's right.
The whole family. All they left out was paradox. But we can talk about that as well.
Sure, sure. So yeah, my background, yeah, where do I start? Well, first of all, in my background image, you'll see good old Hout Bay. So I'm a
Yes.
proudly born and bred South African.
Yes.
I was in London 2 weeks ago, and every time I touch down, I put my feet in South Africa. I'm glad to be here, and
Yeah.
hopefully that will always stay. So born up in the good old Vol Triangle in Vereeniging,
Yes.
the
Wow.
suppose in the steel industry. That was back in the early 70s of Escor, um, that part of the world. So grew up around that part of the world, and then moving on to the West Rand. Um, but I guess coming into the business world, Brian, um, and I often laugh, and I'm going to kind of go all over the place a bit today. I've got two sons that are 20 years old, so
Right.
matriculated 2 years ago, and similar, my peers and my mates will also have children or young adults similar age. And I'll hear some of my friends grow up to me about they wish their sons would get some direction and figure out what they wanted to do in life and need to decide exactly what they do. And I often joke and say, well, I'm 50 odd and I've got no idea what I'm going to do when I grow up. So
Yeah.
it was exactly the same. When I had finished school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was in that era that conscription was still around. So did the good old army. We can have a debate around that, whether you believed in it was right or wrong, but certainly took what I was very much a youngster, 17-year-old, and not knowing anything. And it was a great lesson in terms of just, I suppose, a good leveler,
Yeah.
in that room. And I guess, yeah, you do come out you go into like really a young teenage and do come out, I suppose, a young man. And yeah, Bryan, I think, early in my life, I left the army, joined one of our banks that had changed colors a couple times as well.
Right.
Really, as an admin clerk, good to earn some money. And then I guess early in my life is where I realized I was with one of the banking organizations that it was going to take me a long time to get somewhere very quickly in that organization. And I
Yeah.
recall leaving this organization of 20 odd thousand people and joining a business of two people, the founder and his partner and myself. And at the time, even though everyone said I was completely crazy, on reflection, when you look back at those journeys, I realized those, what's the word, challenging startup environments was something I obviously just enjoyed, and realized that ultra large organizations, I probably wasn't always the ideal fit, because I liked organizations that moved a bit quicker, there was less hierarchies. I think that was a really good point for me. Should I share it on this call, Bryan? Because the guy I joined, who to this day is now, well, probably 30 years my senior, taught me so much about business and people and life, and to this day remains a mentor. And I remember one of the things he taught me very much is around, I think, sales and business development. And actually, since then, no matter what my role has been in an organization, it's been very focused around growth and business development. And I think leaders in businesses every day, we're actually ultimately selling. But he taught me something that he said, like, people buy from people. He had this concept of this thing called belly to belly. And it stuck with me and through today. So even, in an organization where I'm with, and our organization works in the business to business space, but when it comes down to the person dealing with the person on the other side, and if the person on the side doesn't like you, it's can definitely influence if they're going to buy from you. And without risking going all over the place in this new world of AI, I still firmly believe that relationships of people and that belly to belly and that face-to-face engagement and communication are super important. And I kind of fast forward through, I'd worked with this gentleman for a couple of years. We were lucky enough to get involved in growing the business, then selling it into a large listed organization, where again, I'd seen this pattern now this cycle start to emerge, where I was with this listed tech organization. This would have been late 90s. And I left a very successful big tech organization to again join a startup and start a branch for them up in Johannesburg. And so on reflection, I can see the cycle of my journey, I guess, not always fitting into the largest organization, but moving to these organizations where there's probably a bit of a startup entrepreneurial mentality, a very flat structure. And that was a great journey. It was probably 99, 2000. Just at that point in time, I was getting married. and my wife and I had moved down to the Cape. Similarly, where I joined an organization where they were looking for me to come and bring sort of a growth culture into that organization. So I guess over my time, I started to see that journey and did that for a couple of years. And then probably around about 2006, 2007, took my first plunge ever to getting involved in my own business, myself and three partners. And that was a really interesting journey. First of all, you have the ego of telling everyone that you have your own company, and the fact that you're not getting any money or not earning money or getting any salary, putting that aside. And yeah, I guess, you talk about VUCA, that was 2007, just pre the global financial crisis. So I guess, you look back at that, VUCA just has different shapes and forms over time. And we lost that business around about 2009, 2010. We made the decision to close that. And at the time, I recall feeling like such a failure. Having said that, I realized the learnings that came out of that. And over many years going forward, the fact that I'd been in a business that I'd lost was incredibly helpful to me. The lessons I'd learned through that journey of losing that business, the humbling lessons, and actually in years to come, it stood out actually as an advantage to myself. Then I was fortunate enough again to join a listed firm in a tech business, and that listed entity then over time became unbundled into a private equity space. And probably over sort of 2010 through to the 2019 space, I had worked, call it in the tech space, in very much entrepreneurial tech environments. And what's interesting is you can see most of my life now, almost 30 odd years, I've worked in tech organizations. However, I always joke and say that I'm like the least technical person around. And I guess the learning from that for me was definitely, I love what technology can actually do for businesses. So I think that comes from my deep interest or passion in solving problems. So I love to go into organizations and see what business problems they have. So for me, it's less about what technology we have, but how that technology really is an enabler. And I think in parallel to that, it was probably 2012, 13, 14, around there, where I was very fortunate to be in a position where I was managing director of a subsidiary of a listed group. And I think there were two things that stood out for me there. Similarly, I had found people I really enjoyed working with. Some of the individuals there, Bryan in that listed entity.
Yeah.
And what I realized where I succeeded is where you operated in a very high trust environment. So, albeit the pressures were very high. And it was at that point in time where probably call it my midlife crisis, early 40s. I decided, we all know the joke. How do you know somebody's done an MBA? Well, they're going to tell you that they've done the MBA. It was the fact that I'd never studied after school that I decided, I felt that there was something missing. So in my career journey, I perhaps done things the other way around, where a lot of people would go and study and then go on to grow their career. And I was very fortunate with a lot of good breaks along the way, and people supporting me. So in over a 3-year period, I think it was around about 2012 through to 2015, embarked on the MBA journey. And the reason I highlighted it's less around the academic side of that. I absolutely thrived on the relationships I built on that. But that's really where and where I want to get to was the reason I'll tell you that story was putting this thesis together as part of the degree or the dissertation. We had to pick a topic And I've always had this fascination around what makes leaders tick. And so it was through that journey that I put a dissertation together and spent time with about 30 senior executives and leaders and understanding their journey of how they became, and albeit it was titled The Transition into a GM Role, I was really interested in how people move from being in a very functional or specialist role into this very generalist type of role and what made them succeed. And I share that story with you because I have this deep passion again in terms of what makes leaders tick and people tick. And I would think that through my journey, it's whether that's a shared passion of what makes people tick as much as what makes businesses tick, and what problems can we solve. And then I think sort of bringing it forward, probably 2019 to 2024, 25, I was on a 5-6 year journey where, again, we were part of a group of well-established businesses, but we created a new group in 2019 in the fintech space with high growth expectations. And that was an amazing journey. And again, we started this group in May 2019. And the reason I say the timing of that, we had private equity shareholders that, as you know, looked for their pound of flesh. And this was a mere few months before we had this thing called COVID that kicked in. So there's VUCA rearing its head again. Having said that, we endured that. We don't need to remind everyone else about how tough it was to get through that. But again, that was a real test, I think, of leadership. And then our group was fortunate enough that the private equity shareholders had exited the business, and we were acquired by a listed group here late 24. I'd undertaken to see out our first financial year, which I did and wrapped up middle of last year. And then, as you all know, you and I have had some chats since then, decided to take a 6-month sabbatical just to reflect on what I wanted to do next, what was important to me, reconnect with the family, just get health back on track, and made the decision then to get back into the working world literally a month ago. And so that's what brings us here today.
I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh. My guest with me this evening, Steve Mallaby, sound engineer in the background, John O'Shaw, and we here to entertain you. It's a good news business talk show, soul of rock and roll, the heart of business. In the studio with me, Steve Mallaby, the Chief Commercial Officer of MyFanPark. And we're talking about the world of leadership. And so, Steve, in your journey, did you find that your leadership style evolved and morphed, or have you had a golden thread that you've sort of followed throughout your time?
I think, yeah, it's a tough one to think back. I think there's been a thread through that.
Yeah.
In that I've always had a deep curiosity, about people. So, and I think as a leader, sort of my style is very much, I'm a very high level around collaborating with people and wanting to understand it. So I think that interest in people and that style has probably been the thread. I certainly have, I can see how it's definitely matured over the years. So, and I think, when you first step into a leadership role, and I think there's this thing, and it's certainly, there's a well-known phenomenon, this thing called paradox of power. So you've stepped into this senior role. So on paper, on the hierarchy, you've got a senior title, and therefore you think that comes with power. But at the same time, in that initial transition, you can actually kind of feel slightly powerless. And I guess, in your first leadership steps with supervisory or management role, and I can speak for myself, you're going through your own shift. So you think, well, now that you've got the seniority, you can get things done through instruction. And you learn over time. And this is where I talk about the maturity side is you get people to do things not through instruction, but definitely through influence. And I think that's what changes in terms of the maturity of it. But I think my style has always been very much, I'm deeply passionate about giving people growth opportunities. And so if there's a consistent theme, like what I've spoken about, and this was maybe very fortunate, I spoke about my mentor early on, is somebody who believed massively in me, and therefore I felt it that I, owed it in return to deliver to him. And my leadership style is very much like that, that the team members where I've come in, I've tried to instill a really high level of trust in the organization and with my teams that I actually trust them and I've got their backs. And, even in the new organization I'm with, where I'm starting to do one-on-ones with new team members, I spend a lot of time trying to just talk about trust and really get to know the person and emphasize that I'm actually there to have their back. But similarly, in return, I expect that they're going to have my back. So back to your question, has there been a common theme? I think it's that of growth, in that I want to tell people that I'm there to actually create a growth opportunity, because I also know that the more they're going to grow and they're going to excel, ultimately they're going to perform better, and that's going to make the organization better, and hopefully I would have done my role better.
Tell me, did you find yourself encountering a lot of instances where command and control was the de facto order of the day, if you'll excuse the pun on that, and where people were instructed and told what to do and in many ways sort of confined? And what did you see as the impacts of that?
Yeah, I've certainly been in environments where that was present, the command and control. And I want to be cautious to say that was maybe more predominant in the larger organizations. I would say certainly in the larger organizations, in my earlier days, where it was more hierarchical, you didn't have quite as much flat structures. There was a bit more of that command and control. And that certainly would probably have impacted perhaps why I didn't always stay in those organizations, because I didn't necessarily align with that type of culture. Having said that, depending on the types of organizations, there is a place, I think, where you may need a bit more of that. But I guess there would be more organizations, I would hazard a guess, around sort of your military or security type spaces. But I think in those command and control organizations, you say the impact on the organization, my honest opinion is certainly you're not getting the best out of people.
Yeah.
I think you're boxing people. You're not creating an environment where people are unafraid, they would be too scared to perhaps ask questions, challenge the status quo. So you're probably not going to always get the best performers in those organizations. And perhaps that's definitely what led to me leaving organizations and finding organizations where there was a flat structure. And there was more of a, really call it a participative type style or collaborative style of leadership.
I think that the very real challenge is that when you have that fear-based command and control style, that people are in a state of fear and coming from a state of fear, which means that they are more in a fight or flight type of space, not as dramatic as if their lives were threatened. But underneath it all, the impacts of it neurologically are much the same. And it makes it very difficult for those people to step into their prefrontal cortex and their executive brains and to actually be innovative and creative. So they continue to transact and to operationally tick the boxes and do what they've got to do, often at times and maybe increasingly under duress. But it doesn't bring about greatness, and that's a real pity, because those days of where you come out of a very different type of world in the old industrial age and things like that, where you had to have command and control because people's lives could be put at risk if they didn't adhere to very clear structures around safety and regulation. We live in a very different world now. We live in the knowledge age and the information age and well, dare I suggest, the age of the wisdom age. I don't think we are in an age of wisdom. People would like to think they're very wise, but I think that the world shows us that there's a serious lack of wisdom on many, many levels. And I think that's a whole topic for another conversation that we can have and do it again on radio, because it's the irony or paradox of this whole thing we're talking of is that at the heart of inclusive and adaptive and collaborative leadership lies humility. And yet so often what businesses need are these powerful personalities that are able to set a vision and to drive it forward. But often with that comes arrogance, and that arrogance gets in the way, and that often is what blocks that. And people are not, as the old adage goes, they don't tolerate fools easily, and they see themselves as being extra special. And in many instances, they may have special attributes and capabilities, but that doesn't make them any better than the people who work for them and with them. And so it's coming into that space of humility, because in a space of humility, you are, firstly, you teachable, and hopefully you still have a desire for ongoing learning and continuous improvement. But you also become inclusive, and you also become grateful. With that humility comes gratitude. And humility is not in any shape or form a lesser form of strength or character. In fact, it's a greater form of strength and character. And you don't have to push people around and confine them and box them. You actually embrace the idea of hiring people better than yourself. A lot of your do what I say type of leaders hire people like themselves that they can control and manage. That they want to surround themselves with me toos in a lot of ways, and are resistant to hiring really exceptional people who could outshine them and outperform them. Whereas a really great leader is very happy to become indispensable and to allow other people to shine. Don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on so many things there, I think, Bryan, and certainly I think that humility, and interestingly, I can talk about it certainly coming from working in, call it, the fintech industry, and I know fintech is a very broad term, but I recall actually being away recently with one of the leaders of what now is becoming a very large global fintech player. But the CEO of that organization talking to the leadership team is saying, actually, it's responsible for the leaders in that organization to actually hire the best of the best people around them, people that are much smarter than the leaders themselves technically. And so I think there's two parts to that. There's the leader, we've got to have this own confidence in ourselves to know that actually we're not the smartest person in the room. And we will never be smarter than the sum of the group of the room. And I think the humility, that confidence and humility goes so closely hand in hand, because it's having the humility to recognize and appreciate that And in fact, it's a very high level of confidence to have that, to have some much smarter people than yourself in a room. But in this particular fintech organization, they've done that by hiring the leadership team, hire the smartest individuals, because they know that they need those individuals, for that organization to be able to be competitive and beat the next guys. And so it's exactly that. Historically, command and control would never work in that scenario, because you're leading a group of people who are highly intelligent. And how are you going to get them to get things done? And that's the key thing. It's not through instruction. It's not through the command and control. And that's where I think it's very much around creating that purpose of the organization, creating that vision for that organization. The great leaders, I think, will be more about how they get people to buy into and relate to that vision, and purpose of the organization, and realize in many cases that's what's going to drive the people to look to achieve that. So that's my one thought on that. The other one is very much, you talk about in this information or knowledge era. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, you cannot have any conversation today without having AI creep into this conversation, particularly around knowledge. And I recall giving a talk literally just even a few years ago, really, on this transition to GM role, and saying, will AI replace leaders? And AI will never replace leaders. AI will replace the leaders that haven't embraced AI. So it's not AI that's going to have necessarily all the knowledge and replace my knowledge, but it's actually, and that's probably another whole conversation around the AI journey. But I'll just touch on that for a moment. It's really the people that realize that AI is still, I don't want to diminish the value of it, but it's another business tool that we can use. So to your point earlier, you were talking about being teachable and being adaptable. And so I think certainly, and I might be controversial saying this, if I look at peers of my age, sort of early 50s, 30 years of experience, and now we call ourselves experienced leaders, we're the ones that need to actually think about adapting the most. So, the very cynical view is you've done one thing well for 1 year and just practiced it for 30 years in a row, or you continually learn for 30 years in a row. And it's ourselves and leaders that continually either have a hunger to desire and to want to grow and learn all the time, but that have to be teachable and want to be able to teach both themselves and create a culture and organization, which I guess is a learning culture in an organization where they continually, and maybe this might be my personal style, but where I want to create environments for people to want to learn and grow and realize they have to be adaptable and teachable.
Listening to you speak there, Steve, it brings to mind something that's so important, is this principle and concept that organizations have wanted to instill for a long time, which is a workforce that's self-determining, a workforce that's accountable, a workforce that is in itself, proactive and takes initiative and all the rest of it. Now, the reality is that they're not always going to be those people who can do that. They're people who, unlike the song of Bon Jovi, "We Weren't Born to Follow," there are some people who really are good at following and want to follow and want to have somebody show the way and take the way. But underneath it all, every person, regardless of level or where they're at, has to take on, in order to make sure that they remain mobile and marketable and able and a viable service provider, whether they work for an organization or themselves or an entrepreneurial business, in order for them to continue to be an increasingly viable proposition, they have to ask themselves the question of, are they relevant? And what does being relevant mean to them? And how do they determine that? And one of the most important ways of ensuring that you're relevant is that you're optimally effective, and that you continue to increase your portfolio with accomplishment and with value adding. And so you have to ask yourself the question, where and how do I add value to this organization? And in fact, if I'm not, then I need to move on. And what is it about my offering that's going to be able to go the distance? And thereby, you need to look at, am I and my solutions and services that I offer as an employee or as a businessman or entrepreneur, is it in an increasing or diminishing market? How do I price it? How do I package it? How do I market it? How do I take it out there? And this is not suggesting that people should be simply looking to move from where they are in their companies, but they've got to ask the question of, what is it that I do, and how, and what can I do for the world out there, and how required is that, or in demand is that, and what can I do to ensure that that continually remains a viable proposition, and hopefully an increasingly attractive one, even as they move up through the ranks. And I think that's where the whole concept of self-leadership comes in, because in the whole realm of leading other people, we have to start out by leading ourselves really well, and looking at that, and looking at things through a fresh and teachable set of lenses, that is to say, who am I in this whole equation, and what is this purpose of mine? What is my life's purpose? How does that play out in the role that I'm in at work? Because albeit our careers and our work time is probably the biggest chunk of time that gets allocated to anything in our lives, it therefore all the more reason. Is this something that energizes? Is this something that impacts? Am I relevant? Am I of consequence? And how do I ensure that I am? I think those are questions that are so urgently needed to be answered, and not just once, on an ongoing basis. A check-in. Where am I on this journey? Because most people are on a road trip. They don't have milestones. They don't have measured destinations. They don't have, checkpoints. And it's so important to introduce those checkpoints.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the first song we played. What was it? Stop, everybody. What's that sound? Eh? I think that was how the lyric went.
Oh, that was that was the For What It's Worth by Stephen Stills and
That's right.
Neil Young and company. Yes.
And as we were sitting listening, I actually jotted those words down. I think that's such an important point, that that for all of us, Bryan, and regardless of stage as well of career, and whether it be in your work life or your personal life, is to remind yourself. Often sometimes people say, "Hey, just stop and smell the roses."
Yeah.
And I think that sort of, maybe first of all having that awareness, and even through your careers, like just to not, or like just, it's okay to stop and slow down every now and again and listen to that sound or those roses, and and using that analogy, and also bringing it back to your own career, to say, like, okay, you're not just jumping from one to the other. So in my own personal journey, I was very lucky that I had fortunate last year to take that gap and that short sabbatical, but to think about what was important. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
in
And
that
can you believe it? We have come to the end of the show, and we're going to have to do another one for sure, because we've only just skimmed the surface. But I want to wish you huge success in your new portfolio, and may my pin pad and your journey with it just go from strength to strength. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Steve. And just
Thanks,
reminding the
Bryan.
listeners, it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure. Reminding the listeners that if you're not with the ones you love the ones you're with, and take time to show and tell the ones you love just how much you do. Importantly, take some time out to love yourself, give yourself a hug, and take time out to appreciate all the good things that you have, and to never stop expecting miracles. always expect great things. And Jono, thank you so much for driving the engine behind us. You didn't get to say much this time, but next time we will. Steve, take care. All the very best.
Fascinating talk. Thanks, gents.
Thank you for
All
a
the very
wonderful time,
best.
Bryan. Thank you.
Cheers then.